Um, Good morning. I'm Scott Gardner from the Wyoming County Chamber, and I'm pleased to have with us today Emily Martin, who's the owner of Ally HR Partners, who is going to do kind of a combination of two different PowerPoints for us, and I'm going to let her control it and run it. But it's on wage and hour essentials, and what's the other one that we've got here?
Just wage and hour essentials, but there's a couple topics
Inside of that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I was like, I didn't think there was something extra, but okay. All right, perfect. I'm just going to ask everyone as usual to mute your microphones unless you have a question to ask. We can ask them in the chat box as well, and then we can get to questions at the end, unless Emily, you invite people to ask questions at some point during the presentation. We are recording it so that we can share later on, and we'll be just letting people in as they probably tune in as well. So I'll manage that for you. And without further ado, you have all the controls you need, right?
I do, yes.
Okay, well then let's get started.
Cool. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. As Scott mentioned, my name is Emily, and I own Ally HR Partners. We are a small business located in Buffalo, and we help other small businesses and startups with their HR needs. So usually businesses that don't have an HR person on staff already, or have usually someone that's wearing that hat that is probably overwhelmed by all the different regulatory changes and just has time to kind of keep things running with hiring and onboarding, and we provide supplemental help. So today we're going to talk about wage and hour essentials, which basically will be almost like a payroll and time 101 presentation. So we work with clients across all industries of all different sizes, of all different stages of life. These things are pretty much the most basic HR rules and laws. And if there's one area of HR compliance that you want to make sure that you're checking all the boxes, it's wage and hour law. It's the one area that you're most likely to be randomly audited for, or employees are likely to make claims for, because of course with back due wages, there's a lot of money to be made there from the government standpoint, and adding surcharges, and then obviously your employees getting back due pay. So we're going to cover that today. Most of what we're going to cover applies to all business types in industries. So when I say we work with clients across all industries, these things pretty much apply to everybody. So it's nice that regardless of what business you're tuning in from, you can learn something today and take something away. We'll keep it pretty casual. If you have questions throughout, you can throw it in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask your question there as well. All right, so we'll get into it here. As Scott mentioned, we're recording this too. So, you'll be able to receive recording after and get access to these materials. And of course, you can reach out afterwards with questions. So just a little HR 101 here, just talking about who regulates employers. We have the pleasure or displeasure, I guess, of living in New York State. And so we have to deal with both federal and a very active state government when it comes to regulating employment matters. So this just gives you an idea basically between all these federal agencies, the federal DOL, the NLRB, the FLSA, Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, IRS at the federal level, and then all these state departments. There are a lot of different governing bodies that are issuing laws and rules and interpreting and reinterpreting things that make it pretty difficult and fast moving to be an employer in New York State. This is why a client would usually bring us on, especially in this time of COVID. These things are changing all the time, and it's really hard to keep track of what you need to be doing to be compliant. So today we're going to talk about wage and hour law, which is, again, anything kind of payroll and time related. Again, this can be regulated at both the federal or state level. And this is a really expensive area to not be compliant, right? So the worst situation that can occur is that either through an employee making a claim or through a random audit through the federal DOL or even the state wage and hour division here in New York, they come in, they recognize that you're you're doing something wrong and now you owe employees back pay. In some cases, it can go up to 6 years. Usually it's more like 2 or 3 years. And then usually these agencies will charge 25% on top of what you owe to your employees for themselves as like a penalty. So you can imagine with wages, these things could add up pretty quickly over that amount of time. And with that 20% or 25% surcharge on there. This is the #1 area by far of claims, both at the federal and state level. Again, it's a money-making area for the government where other things like even sexual harassment compliance and things are not. So, of course, where the money is where, you know, is where everyone goes. So you can imagine that's why there's so many claims here. So there are benefits to catching and fixing problems on your own. So if through this presentation today, you recognize that you may not be doing something right, or you follow up afterwards and we do an audit specifically of your business, if we rectify that problem on your own and issue some back pay to your employees, which is, you know, what we would recommend, you only have to go back 2 years of time and you don't have to pay that fine. So if afterwards the government comes in and audits you, you could say, listen, we know we had that issue, we took care of it, and you're not going to have all that additional cost to deal with. So there is a benefit to doing that. So why should you care? Just another tidbit of information here. Again, because there's dual federal and state oversight. In the last 5 years, the U.S., which is the Federal Department of Labor, recovered $1.4 billion in, you know, past due wages to employees. So that's all a result of claims or audits where people weren't doing things like calculating overtime correctly or paying, you know, the salary minimum wage or whatever it might be. So that's a lot of money, and that's only the federal DOL. So you can imagine what would happen if you added in state numbers. And there is increased enforcement and collaboration and tougher regulations under the Biden administration. So if you follow anything law related or employment law related, you would see that, you know, the federal DOL and those agencies that we listed on the first slide, they have clearly and explicitly said that they're going to be working together. So if one of those agencies comes in and audits you for something and they see something that is in another agency's jurisdiction, they're going to be contacting them and letting them know. And they're going after employers to actually find violations now. They're not even waiting for complaints or, you know, information to come in that you might be violating. So if there is any time to make sure you're compliant, it is now, because the sharks are very much in the water. So just a quick caveat before we get too deep. Like I said, almost all the information in the presentation today applies regardless of what industry you're in, or, you know, what size you are or anything like that. But there is maybe more nuance that we're not going to cover in this presentation for certain industries. So if you find that you're learning a lot in this presentation and things you didn't know, chances are we probably should take it a little bit deeper and do a more thorough audit. So what I'm saying is, just because you check all the boxes in the presentation today doesn't mean there aren't other things you need to consider. So I would say reach out to dig deeper in the future. Okay, so a quick lesson on wage and hour law, which is, again, all things payroll and time. At the federal level, it's regulated by the FLSA primarily. They do things like set federal minimum wages. They have the predominant rulings on overtime regulations, employee exemption statuses, you know, child labor and things. And then in New York State, we have our own minimum wages. They set rules specifically on payroll frequency, breaks. There's a lot of other specific rules as well. And then we actually in New York State have 5 different specific wage orders. So depending on what industry you're in, there's a whole wage order that has special rules and regulations for your industry. So these are all the things, like I said, where if we did do an audit with you, we would dive deeper and go through all of these wage orders for your business and make sure you checked all the boxes. So again, the point of this slide is just to illustrate this isn't like black and white, cut and dry. And there's a lot of nuance that most businesses that don't know about. And that's where usually the problems are lurking when you get an audit and there's unsuspecting things that you're not doing right. All right, so the first topic we're going to talk about is employee classifications. So the first topic really quick, which has become a pretty relevant topic since the Biden administration took over, is this idea of contractors versus employees. So before we even start talking about how you pay employees, let's first talk about, what an employee is, and if you even, have people that work for you properly classified, where you determine how you need to pay them from just either a payroll standpoint or like a contractor standpoint and 1099s. So a lot of businesses or business owners don't understand or realize that this really isn't a matter of discretion and preference by the business. There are rules that and tests, they're called, at both the federal and the state level that if the IRS were to come in and audit you, or the DOL, they would question whether or not your contractors are really actually employees based on some of these, test factors that they have in place. And the IRS and the Department of Labor have huge incentive, especially now in this very employer-friendly environment or employee-friendly environment, to have the tests kind of err on the side of employee, because there's a lot more taxes that the government can get out of you if someone is an employee versus a contractor, from an IRS standpoint. And then from a DOL standpoint, the DOL has no ability to reach to your business and regulate how you pay your employees and, audit you and fine you for violations of that if those people aren't employees to begin with, right? So they would rather have these people be classified as employees rather than contractors. So if you have contractors now, some things that you should consider and ask, and some questions you should ask yourself to determine whether or not that's the proper classification, are things like, do they have other work for others? Do they do other work for others? Do they have an LLC? Are you one of many clients, right? So is it really that they're running their own business, or do they just work for you? What scope of control do you have over how they do their work? So if you're pretty much controlling everything in terms of the tools they use and the time frame that they have to get things done and the schedule they work every day and where they have to show up to work every day, that would insinuate and be very much the level of control of an employee. So in that case, the auditing agency would probably say that that person is really an employee, not a contractor. How you pay them matters. Are they paid like in the payroll cycle of your other employees? Are they paid by the hour? That all sounds like an employee situation. And then if you have employees doing the same type of work as the contractor, that obviously looks really bad, because you actually have employees that do that. So are you really just trying to skirt, all the unemployment and other things that go along with that one employee and having them as a contractor? So these are all things that they would look at. So again, if you have contractors on your staff, just something to think about and consider. There's more information on our website actually on really specific factors of this test. So if you're concerned at all, I would check that out and do a little audit of those individuals. All right. So the next kind of type of classification that we're going to talk about is, this is probably one of the most ubiquitously misunderstood areas of how you pay your employees in employment law. And that is this idea, or the difference between exempt and non-exempt status. So really, in layman's terms, usually people think of this as either salaried or hourly employees. Non-exempt is usually what we attribute with hourly employees, which non-exempt actually means that they are not exempt from being paid overtime. Double negative, typical, government confusing language there. But that basically means that you pay them hourly because if they work over 40 hours in a work week, you have to pay them overtime. So that's usually why non-exempt employees are paid hourly and why we associate those things together. Exempt status means obviously then that they don't have to be paid overtime regardless of the amount of hours they work in a work week. And in that case, we usually pay people on a salaried basis because it doesn't matter how many hours they work. We don't have to track it. We can pay them a flat rate, and it's just easier, and we don't have to worry about that. So, I think most employers and frankly, most employees want to be paid a salary and they want to be paid on an exempt basis because of the status that's associated with that. It's easy, it's a guaranteed amount of money in their paycheck each week. But the government wants everyone to be non-exempt because, of course, they want people to be paid overtime, and there's a lot more tricky violations that you can run into when people are non-exempt. So we have this opposing idea, but basically there is a test that positions have to pass in order to be exempt. So let's talk about that. So again, this is not something that is a matter of discretion and not a matter of your preference or an employee's preference on how they get paid. There are really fast and hard rules that you apply to how you pay people. And so you want to make sure you get this right, because this is a really easy area to get in trouble. So to be classified as exempt, and again, that means for an employee to not need to be eligible to be paid overtime and to pay them on a salaried basis, they have to meet both a minimum wage test and a duties test. So we all know there's an hourly minimum wage. A lot of people don't know that there's a salaried minimum wage. New York State has its own salaried minimum wage at the moment. It supersedes and is higher than the federal minimum wage. And for most positions, that number is this $51,480 annually. So if you have employees that are making less than that amount annually, they probably should, well, they shouldn't be paid on a salaried basis, and they shouldn't be considered exempt. They should be getting overtime if they work over 40 hours, always in that situation. So that's a pretty easy black and white part of the test. These other categories of exemption, qualification, professionals, this 35 number, that's for really, really specific like carve outs of positions like chemists or PhDs. It does not include, an accountant or an HR person or anything like that. So don't be fooled by that in that lower number. Most of your positions are not going to fall into that. And most of them are going to fall into these executive and administrative categories, which have this higher 51,000 number associated with them. So the other part of this test that people definitely don't usually know about is this duties portion. So even if you're going to pay someone $52,000 a year or $100,000 a year, if the position doesn't meet this duties test also, then the position also cannot be exempt from overtime payment. So what this means is basically, does the position have certain responsibilities associated with it and levels of decision-making and management responsibilities that qualify it to be exempt? So the executive category is the easiest one. It's basically, does the person have employees that report to them, and do they have hiring and firing decision-making ability over them? That would safely be exempt. Administrative is the other most common area that positions or category that positions get bucketed into. This has to do a lot with using independent judgment and discretion in the employee's job. It has to be about matters of significance. Usually they say it also has to be over like a back end part of the business. So like managing part of the business functionality in the back end. So again, something could fall into here, but you just want to make sure that the position passes both the duties test and the minimum wage test in order to be classified safely as exempt. There is a really in-depth checklist of this on our website that you can download. And, if you want to fill one out for each position that is exempt, I would recommend that. And then you have it if you're ever audited. But it's important to understand that both of these requirements have to be met. So any questions about this slide? Because I know this topic is a little bit confusing, and it's something that most people don't know isn't super easy to begin with. All right, we'll keep going. So the other category obviously then is non-exempt. If you're going to default someone, if you're unsure at all if they pass that duties test, this is always the safest default. Again, these are your hourly employees. These are your employees that you track their hours and then you pay overtime if they work over 40. So basically anyone who's not exempt. Obviously, there are minimum wages for hourly employees as well. That number right now is $13.20 per hour in Western New York. Other parts of the state, it's higher. Fast food in our part of the state is 15, but it's not 15 for everywhere else right now. So in case you didn't know that, that's a common misunderstood thing right now as well. So just make sure these people are being paid minimum wage and you're tracking their hours worked and you're good to go. So really the takeaway of this kind of category or this section on classifications is obviously, first of all, if you have contractors, make sure that they're safely contractors and that they shouldn't be employees. For non-exempt employees, you should always be paying them hourly. So if a position doesn't meet that duties and minimum salary test to be exempt, please treat them as non-exempt and track their hours and pay them hourly. You always should track your hours for non-exempt employees. If you don't have time records, basically, if you're ever audited or I as an employee want to just claim in 2 years that you didn't pay me overtime the whole time I worked for you, you're going to be paying me overtime, whatever I say it is that I worked. If you don't have a record, it didn't happen. That is always the way the DOL will work. So please make sure that you're tracking employee hours for your hourly employees. Review all positions and people being paid salary and make sure they qualify. We already talked about that. Review minimum wages. Minimum wages probably will go up again at the end of 2022, both hourly and salaried. So keep an eye out for that. Usually you have to increase them by December 31st. So, if that happens, make sure you're ready to do that. And of course, when in doubt, pay hourly or contact a professional to review these things with you. All right, so that concludes that section. Again, any questions about employee classifications at all? All right, so now we'll move on to another section of wage and hour law, which is, regulated by the same agencies and usually targeted in the same audits, which is time and attendance practices. So the first thing I want to talk about is meal period breaks. And a lot of this stuff is especially relevant to your hourly employees, right? Because when it comes to tracking hours or meal periods, which may be time that you're deducting from an employee's time record, obviously, if you're taking that time away, that means that's time that's not adding up toward their overtime hours eligibility, right? So most of this is mostly relevant for hourly staff because it really can affect their payment of wages. So in general, in New York State, all employees are required to receive a 30-minute meal period break if they work 6 hours or more for you in a shift. That doesn't have to be paid. It can be unpaid, but it needs to be uninterrupted, unworked, and the employee needs to be getting that time. The 2 15-minute breaks that are required, those are paid, so I'm not so worried about them. Again, this meal period compliance area, the state really only cares about it when it's a money-making mechanism, which would be in a situation where you're not paying your employees for their breaks, but they're not taking them, they're working through the breaks, and now those are back to wages that you owe, right? So that's usually what happens with these audits. There are very few exceptions for when an employee is not required to take these breaks, so you want to make sure that your employees are doing that. And like I said, they must be uninterrupted. So when we're talking about best practices when it comes to meal periods, you really, especially if you're not paying your employees for these meal period breaks, you really should have them recording actual live time punches that they're taking these breaks and when they are. As I said before, when it comes to especially employee payroll records or time records, if it's not recorded, it didn't happen. And that will always be the case when you're combating a claim about this. So if I, as an employee, just want to make up a story that I actually never took my breaks over the last 3 years and you deducted 30 minutes from my check each day for my break, you will certainly be losing that claim and you will be paying that person for 3 years, of 30 minutes a day times 5 days a week. And then maybe any overtime on top of that added up, right? So please, if you're not paying for breaks, make sure that there's time punches and an employee's time record that shows that they're actually taking that. Another kind of solution you could go to is just pay for the meal period breaks, right? So you say, hey, we want you to take your breaks, but we're going to pay them as an added benefit to you. And that way you don't really care if they took them or not, because there's no incentive for anyone to go after you for those unpaid wages. So there's a lot less concern in that situation. So that is something that employers have kind of defaulted to doing, just to avoid that potential compliance issue. This emphasizes the non-exempt hourly employees' time tracking need, as we already talked about. I definitely would not recommend auto deducting breaks. If you are going to not pay breaks, you really should have those punches occurring. Now, you may work with a payroll company that happily set that up for you. They really don't care about compliance when it comes to a lot of this stuff. They're not there to keep you compliant. They're just there to basically broker a payroll software to you. So even though they set it up that way, it does not mean it's in your best interest to have it that way. So please don't be tricked by that. And again, you are defenseless against any claims of improperly deducted breaks if they, didn't happen, right? So you want to make sure that they're being recorded. So this is a huge area, again, where this can cost you a lot of money over time. So please, and actually a lot of times there's class actions here, but one employee will make a claim and then the other ones will join in saying they actually never took their breaks. So again, this is stuff that can add up really quickly. So any questions about meal periods? All right. I'm not sure if there's anybody on this webinar who owns a business that is in hospitality that may be paying tipped wages. But just some quick tips about tips here. There is a separate minimum wage still for tipped employees. If you want to take that tip credit, all that information is here. There really is a ton of nightmarish nuance around tips. So if you are a business that pays employees tips or is taking a tip credit in any way, I would recommend checking out other specific content on our site about this or reaching out, because this is an area to really get in a lot of trouble quickly, especially now the federal government's starting to chime in more about this too. So make sure you check out this information later if this is you. Just some other little known rules on time and attendance type issues and payroll issues and compliance. New York State has a law and a rule that says all physical labor employees must be paid weekly. That definition of physical labor employee has expanded over time. Basically, if you have employees that aren't working in an office, technically New York State would say that they need to be paid weekly. So if you're running your payroll on any cadence other than weekly, you may want to consider changing that to weekly just based on that law. There's been more enforcement of that rule in the last year. So it's something to kind of consider and take care of now. And you can talk with your payroll company about that. There's some other nuanced rules here. Spread of hours pay has to do with, if an employee works over 12 hours in a day. Call-in pay, which is basically if an employee works less than 4 hours, you need to pay them a minimum 4 hours. And then there's this idea of weighted overtime, which has to do with paying hourly employees, and if you pay them any commissions or anything like that, all of those wages have to be included in the overtime calculation if they ever work overtime. So these are other, again, really specific rules, especially this section of weighted overtime is really quite complicated, but very problematic potentially if you're audited. So again, check out more content on our website that contains some information about these things. But if any of these, pop a alarm bell in your mind because you're not doing them, certainly encourage you to reach out with questions or to go through them more thoroughly together. All right, the last topic we're going to cover, which is also regulated in most cases by the wage and hour division of the DOL, is time off. So again, if they come in and they're auditing your payroll records, now this time off is going to be a part of that audit as well. So the biggest topic here is the topic of New York State paid sick leave. I think you guys probably, maybe attended a webinar on this a couple of years ago. I think the chamber put one on. But make sure you understand what the obligations really are here. Basically, what this law did was mandate employers to provide paid time off to employees for the first time ever. So this is above and beyond like COVID paid sick leave and New York State paid family leave and disability leave and all of that. This is actually time off that employees have to earn, and the employer is responsible for paying to the employee 100% of. So this took place effective 1/1/2021. So it's been like a year and a half now. You have to offer this to all employees. You can see the chart down here. I mean, most businesses are going to be in the 40 hours at least of paid time off or paid sick leave. And it applies to all employees. So it doesn't matter if someone's a seasonal employee, a temporary employee, if they're super part-time, you do need to make sure they are getting paid sick leave. They're earning it and they're able to use it at the pace that is required by this law. So we do have a really in-depth recorded webinar on this subject on our website. It was probably a year and a half ago that we did this. So if you are unsure if you're compliant with this, really, I mean, this could be a whole webinar. Well, it is a whole webinar in itself. So I'm not going to go too deep, but check that out if you're unsure whether you're compliant with that. The biggest takeaway I would say to you, and this is kind of something that was misunderstood. If you already had like a vacation or a PTO policy, you did not need to, and you do not need to be offering additional paid sick leave time on top of that time. So you can simply modify your PTO policy or your vacation policy to meet all the requirements of paid sick leave in terms of earning amounts and that kind of thing, and just keep that same amount there. So I'm sure most businesses can't absorb giving employees an additional 40 hours or 56 hours of time off each year. So you do have that option. So if that's not what you did and you want to talk about how to do that, we can explore that together, but make sure you know that part. And while we're on this topic, just as kind of an added bonus here, aside from New York State paid sick leave, you do have other time off requirements when it comes to employees. These are more traditional types of leaves. So these are actually leaves of absence that an employee would have to apply for, fill out paperwork for. You would submit to an insurance carrier. They would receive benefits from that insurance carrier, not paid by you. But make sure, again, we have a whole recording of a webinar on this topic on our website as well. But if you don't know about these obligations and you don't know how to be compliant with them in terms of paperwork and all of that, again, reach out or check out that webinar because this is a huge area where employees are exercising their rights more than ever. COVID made employees more aware of leave rights than ever. So, definitely make sure you have a plan for how to deal with these things. And also as a reminder, New York State COVID sick leave is still a thing. So if you have employees that are missing time because of COVID, you may still need to pay them for more time off for that COVID sick leave as well on top of all this other stuff. So again, more information on our website on that topic as well. So the final takeaways for this time off subject, if nothing else, ensure you're at least minimally compliant with New York State paid sick leave. So again, you should be giving all of your employees some sort of time off for that paid sick leave rule. You should be able to track the earning and the usage of that in your payroll system. So, check out that with your payroll provider if you haven't already. Do not stop offering paid and protected time for COVID related absences. You may or may not, if the employee took that time before, still have to do it. So if you have a situation, again, check out our site or reach out, but just be aware of that. Understand attendance management implications. So, if people are using their paid sick leave or, they're requesting time to use it, but they already used up their sick leave or their other time off, track all of that in your payroll system. Because again, if you're audited and that's questioned, you're going to want to prove that you actually gave them the time and that they took it. And then know those other job protected time off requirements, which are all those leave requirements that we just talked about. Final note here, obviously a lot of this stuff is related to your payroll system and your payroll provider. Again, if you leave here with nothing else, it should be the fact that Your payroll provider has nothing to do, and they have no obligation in any way in any contract you sign with them to keep you compliant with wage and hour law. They are supposed to remit an accurate payroll every week. They're supposed to, send your taxes and all of that to New York State. But they are not making you compliant or making sure you are compliant. In fact, I mean, you could be paying employees a minimum wage rate below minimum wage, and that's not their problem. It's your problem. So, that being said, though, there are better payroll providers than others that look out for you and are willing to, proactively work on solutions to these things with you. Complete Payroll, I know they're a member of the chamber. I work in close partnership with them, which you'll see on my website. So, that's one to check out if you're unhappy with your provider currently. These other systems, are big people in the game. They do have really good technology to help manage a lot of this stuff, but press your provider to find solutions to all of these things, right? Whether it's the meal period tracking or time off tracking and accruals and all of that stuff. But they're not going to do it in most cases unless you ask. So please be proactive about doing that. And again, just a caveat, all the information we covered today is most likely relevant to you, but there is more nuance. So if you're uncertain at all, I would suggest just reaching out about doing a thorough audit and just to make sure that you can go to bed feeling okay and safe each night and know that you at least are going to pass an audit or, pass a claim if there's one ever made, because you don't want to find out the hard way and then have to pay all that back due wage money and all of those fines. So if you have questions or you need more help or you want to check out a lot of the other resources that are, related to this topic or a lot of the other topics we talked about today, you can go to our website. All the information is there. There's recorded webinars, there's written articles, just a lot of free information that is really helpful. You can contact us through the website as well, or you can just contact me directly at this email address here. You can also follow us on Instagram or LinkedIn. We're constantly, providing employment law updates there that you need to know. We also have a newsletter where we send a lot of updates or articles or recordings of webinars and things. So you don't need to miss out on all of those resources if you subscribe to that as well. So please check all that out, and I'm sure you'll find some good stuff that can help you. Just a quick note on our business, again, we help small businesses that don't really have the time or, resources to keep on top of these HR things and address these HR things. We help them do that. So if you're interested in learning more about that, certainly reach out. It can make a big difference, especially in today's world that's pretty employee friendly and, anti-employer. So encourage you to reach out if you're having problems, but we deal with employee relations issues, compliance, and even more strategic HR needs or desires. And that is it. So please, if you have questions, do not be shy. You can unmute yourself and ask them via mic, or you can send a question through the chat, but please don't be shy about anything that you want more clarification on.
Thank you, Emily. We'll leave the chat box open. There was, as always, when dealing with employees, there's lots of information to absorb. So this is a good time for people to ask questions. I was going to ask one that I had seen. How do you calculate, and this may be sort of a basic question, but how do you calculate that overtime over the 40 hours for that employee? What makes up the calculation? Is that the right?
Yeah. Are you talking about like the weighted overtime part of it?
No, just I would say standard overtime. So an employee that, that you've now had to move them from what you thought was exempt to non-exempt and need to start figuring out their an overtime rate.
Yeah.
How would you do that?
It would just be 1.5 times, so 1.5 times their normal rate, and you would just pay that on any hours they worked over 40. So if they worked 42 hours, they would get the regular rate at the first 40, and then 1.5 times the regular rate for the other 2 hours. And that should be, again, like, you shouldn't even actually have to calculate that. It should be in the payroll system to just know, like, this person's not exempt, it went over 40, and then it just automatically does that calculation and adds it in.
Right. I'm sure the weighted system is a bit more complicated than that, right?
Yeah, I just wrote a piece on that I hope is clear, and there's, math examples, which probably makes it a little bit easier to understand, but weighted overtime, basically the idea is, which a lot of people don't know, and it's specific to New York State, that you have to calculate overtime this way, but basically, like, if you have an employee that works 2 different pay rates, or has like commission or certain bonus types, like, as part of their pay, you have to use that money as a part of their total regular earnings to then calculate the time and a half rate, right? So the point is, like, it could really increase that time and a half amount, because if you're dividing, their straight hourly wages earned of like $500 by 40 hours, that's obviously going to be a lot less than if you add in a $300 bonus and now you're dividing $800 by 40 hours. That's going to be a much higher overtime rate, right? So a lot of people don't know that those things like bonuses and commissions have to be included in that overtime calculation. So, check out that article on our website about that.
Okay. Sounds good. I don't see any questions coming in the chat. No one has come on the screen. They're certainly welcome to. We'll wait I'll give you another 30 seconds here before we start to wrap up. But
yeah, even questions about the COVID, paid sick leave that's still around, and
do we have an idea how long that's going to last? Do we think it's going to continue to the end of the year or extend beyond that?
yeah, I mean, there's no talk about canceling it, and it has actually no sunset date written into the law, so it could go forever. But one point I want to make about that is, if you have an employee who's already taken it for actually having a positive COVID diagnosis, although the law says people can take it up to 3 times, it doesn't insinuate that once they take it for an actual positive COVID case, they don't need to be given it again. And that's something that's a little bit debated in like the legal world, but just know that you don't have to pay someone continuously if they keep getting COVID, basically. And make sure at least that you're getting proof of like a positive test if you are, from an actual doctor. You don't have to just take a photo of a test as like proof. Because these things just add up, like between, New York State paid sick leave and COVID paid sick leave and all these other things employers are having to pay for, like, it can cost a lot of money.
So are you saying that an employer can require more of a medical diagnosis rather than the self-certification that you can print off from the health department, or I know our county website has one?
Yeah. I mean, if it's basically like you can require something beyond just them going to Rite Aid, getting a home test kit, and taking a picture of that positive test. So like at least have them go to a testing center and get tested and then send those official results to you. If it's from the Department of Health saying they have COVID, I'm assuming that's, pretty legitimate. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, it seems like everyone else is shy, so.
That's okay. Or they got enough information, or they can, or they may email you separately with a question or something later. We'll, that you invited them to do that, so we'll allow that too. But
Thank you for having me. And
yeah, if there's no other questions, yes, thank you for joining us this morning and giving this information. We hope to have you back for some other subjects here, maybe in the fall. If anybody has any, I'm going to put that out there. If anyone has any ideas on topics that they'd like to learn more about, certainly feel free to email me, and we can maybe put something together, on some specific topics. So with that, I would just say thank you and wish everyone else a good day, and we'll sign off.
Yes. All right. Thanks. Have a great day.
Yep, thank you. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.